We're going to start talking about value and shading and just how to use some common drawing materials. So I'm starting by pointing at the end of the pencil here. I got 4B, a 2B, and a 4H. So those are the drawing pencils that you're starting with. And then you should also have just like a standard writing pencil, like a mechanical pencil works well. That's your HB. I have a couple things here for shading, brushes, a paper stump, a paper towel, and then a kneaded eraser and a pencil eraser. Now, before we get started on this worksheet, I want to throw this idea out there, something to keep in mind. You want your marks to follow form. Now, anytime you make a mark with your pencil, you're creating a small amount of value, and your value defines the form that you're trying to create, because value gives the illusion of form. And we'll come back to this in a second here when we get to shading those spheres. Let's start doing the value scale. So on one end, I'm going to use my 4B for the darkest square, because 4 is larger than 2, so it's darker, and B stands for black, and the graphite is really soft, so it comes off easy. And then my HB is in the middle, between B and H, and then my H is light. H stands for hard, the graphite is hard, and it doesn't come off very well, so it stays really light. Now, to fill this in, I'm going to start right in the middle with HB, just a medium pressure. Then I'm going to go one to the right with a little bit more pressure, and then I'll go one to the left with a little less. Now, keep in mind here that this video is sped up. It's faster than what it is in real life, so don't think that you need to work this fast. You know, work whatever pace you're comfortable with, but it's going to be slower than this for sure. That darkest square, that's my 4B. I'm pushing pretty hard. I'm getting that pencil to be as dark as it could go. One step down, I have a 2B here, and I'm just trying to fill in the gap between those two squares. And then on the lightest end, I'm using my 4H and just barely dragging it across the paper for that lightest one, and just a little bit more pressure. Now I have my 1 through 7 values, and I'm going to reference these when we move on to shading these spheres now. So we're starting with two-dimensional circles, and we're going to use value to transform them into three-dimensional forms. And we're going to turn them into three-dimensional forms using a variety of mark-making techniques, starting with hatching. So we're going to start with hatches. Now, hatching is just a series of lines that are going one direction, like this. So let's look at this basketball and remember that first rule that we wrote down. Your marks must follow the form. So look at this line and how it curves around the surface of the sphere, how it follows the form of the basketball. Now in the middle it's kind of flat, but towards the ends it curves pretty dramatically. And that's what really gives the illusion that it's a rounded surface. And you can compare that to like a flat two-dimensional basketball here with these straight lines. And even if there's a little bit of shadows and highlights like on the sides here, it doesn't do anything. I mean, it still looks completely flat. And so that's a good example of how important it is that your marks follow the form. Now here I have a sphere, and I'm going to look really closely and try to identify values. And I kind of put some swatches here, and each one of these swatches could be a different number on the value scale that we just made. So the one that's closest to the light source, that really white one, that would be like my 1 value, and then 2, and 3, and 4. Then you got the darkest area, that's a 7. Cast shadows is 7. Something to point out here, that 3, the darkest area isn't at the bottom. There's reflected light that is hitting the surface that the object is sitting on and bouncing back up and bringing some lighter value there. So that's something to keep in mind. So now I have to use these hatches to create these different values. So some of the ways I can do that is I can break my hatches apart, I can use less pressure, I can push harder to get them darker, and then get them to be closer together. And you can kind of see that little illustration from light to dark. So I'm using my hatches to add value, and then my marks need to follow form. So you can see how I'm pulling them down from the corners and wrapping them around the surface of the sphere, just like that line on the basketball that we looked at. Hopefully you can start to pick out all these things that we've talked about. You can see my hatch marks breaking apart towards the light source. You could see some more pressure and them getting closer together in the shadow here. You could see how they're curving around at the sides, and following the surface. So let's see if we can do it on paper now. It's pretty much the same thing. I basically just don't have that photograph that I'm working on top of, but my marks are curving pretty much the same. I'm breaking them apart as it gets closer to the light source and really kind of piling them on top of each other where I want there to be a shadow. So I'll slow it down just a little bit here so that you can get a look at what it looks like closer to the light source. You can see these little hatch marks, the light amount of pressure, and you got to do that in order to get a smooth transitions of values. Because if you bring your value all the way up to light source and then just stop making hatch marks, there'll be a really steep drop off, and that won't make it look like a rounded surface. So we need those little marks to help the transition of values. All right, on to the next circle and the next mark making technique, and this one is cross hatching. So it's just like hatching. Hatching's all going one direction, and then you're just crossing it, going the other way. So if we look back at this basketball, we can see a little bit of it. We see the one going horizontal, and then we see the other line coming vertical. And that's it. So we can look at a little bit of a better example here that you might recognize, and that'd be the longitude and latitude of a globe. So here we got a really good example. We have lines going vertical and lines going horizontal. They're intersecting, they're creating cross-hatching. So how do we know where they go? Now if we draw a line right down the middle of the axis, and then as we move to the left of that axis, those lines are bulging more and more. And then same on the right. And that's a really important feature to recognize, and it'll come in handy in a lot of other situations. So let's look real quick at some examples of how cross-hatching can be used to add value. Old woodcut prints use this technique. Comic illustrators use this technique. And you've definitely seen it on the portraits on your dollar bills. So it's everywhere in illustration. Now let's get some practice applying it. I have skipped ahead in this demonstration a little bit because we just did hatching, and I'm starting off exactly like I'm starting hatching, with the marks going all, kind of horizontal around it. And now the only thing I'm doing different is I'm adding the lines going the other way, the lines that are crossing, those kind of vertical lines. And I'm doing exactly what I showed in the globe, how on the left side of the axis they're bulging to the left, and then on the right side of the axis they're bulging to the right. So you still got two things to think about. You got the amount of value that you're adding and going through the value scale, and the direction that your marks are going, and the surface that you're creating the illusion of. And we're going to jump right into the next technique of stippling. Stippling is basically just dots. And you just need to push your pencil into the paper. You don't need to, jab it very hard. But I'm just using dots to create value. My value's following form, and it's kind of the same stuff we've been talking about. So hopefully it's starting to make sense. You can kind of see what this technique could be really good for, and it almost looks like that first photograph of that styrofoam ball, right? It's because it creates a nice sense of texture. All right, so onto this final one here, and this is blended technique. Now, I go about this technique in a couple stages. I call it passes. So I do a first pass where I just map out the form. And I'm going to use hatching and cross hatching to kind of plan where the shadows are going to be and just block in that form. Now, this technique will end up being pretty realistic, but I'm not worrying about any of that yet. I'm not worrying about details or even matching value right now. I'm just worrying about mapping out where these shadows are going to be and mapping out the form. So once I have the hatching and cross hatching done, I'm going to use a blending stump and just kind of move some of this value around, try to get some little smoother transitions and kind of get the marks to disappear a little bit. Now, I'm moving into the second pass. I'm going to look back up at the value scale and Now I'm going to really start to try to match values accurately. I need the 1 value all the way through the 7 value. So how do I get my 1 value? Well, that's basically the paper. I got to leave the paper showing through. So a common mistake that people will make is they'll cover the entire thing with marks, but then you get rid of the whole second, the lighter part of the value scale, and then you don't have any highlights. So I need to hold off on the marks in the highlight areas, and then I need to get all the way to that other end of the value scale to the 7, and I'm going to be grabbing my 4B pencil and using quite a bit of pressure and really pushing the value and getting darker there. So if you can see that I'm starting to do that right now. I'm going along that core shadow, like if you remember looking at that photograph, how there was that dark line kind of like right in the middle. It's a little bit lighter towards the bottom where there's reflected light. I'm using some hatching and cross hatching to make the transition a little bit smooth. It doesn't go from the 7 value right to the 3. It goes from a 7 to a 6 to a 5. So you're going to have to use marks to make those transitions smoother. I'm getting kind of close here, so I'm throwing in the cast shadow where the object is blocking the light from hitting the surface that it's sitting on. And I'm gonna start kind of finalizing this here. So the paper stump is really good for moving lots of value around and moving and covering up the marks. The brush is really good for towards the end of the drawing when your shading is much softer and much more subtle. And the reason I want that soft shading is because I'm trying to really create the illusion of a rounded surface. And that's why I keep going back in here. So you see I'm kind of making those hatch marks right above that center. And it's just an attempt to smooth that transition of values to create the illusion of a rounded surface. Because if I leave a quick transition of value, I'm showing that there's an edge there, a hard edge, or like a corner. And that's not at all what I want. So once I feel like I have my values all good, I'm moving on to my third pass. My third pass is details and highlights. So anything that's on the surface, hair, pores, or anything that I need to go back and erase. So I kind of did a little bit of erasing towards the highlight, and then some erasing on the bottom there where there is the reflected light. So a little bit of erasing, and then some marks to even out the transition of values, and then that brush to blend it, and that's pretty much good. So I'm going to call this blended sphere done. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Good luck with all of your shading.